All right, greetings everybody. Hi, this is Dave Fortson from the Regen Network team, from the Loa Labs team. Just getting started here. I'm just waiting for Gregory. Is going to be hosting today's discussion with Matthew and John around AI and ReFi, reports from the edge. Welcome Sophia and Sari from the R&D team. Good to see you. And everyone just stand by for a second. Gregory should be here in just a minute. He's usually running from meeting to meeting, so stand by. Oh, there's Gregory. Hold on just a sec.
Hey everyone, good morning.
Greetings, Gregory. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm good. In this case, instead of running from meeting to meeting, I was running from sugar house to meeting because
That it is that time of the
the
year, isn't it?
maple sap is a flowing.
Fantastic. So, could you remind me again of the thumbnail process of where you're at now and what's next on the maple production?
Yeah, just yeah, for those who don't know, I have the privilege to steward a little maple syrup farm, agroforestry farm. And about this time of year, as the temperature in the day comes above freezing and then goes back below freezing at night, the sap starts to run. And so over the last couple of weeks, we've been taking the deadfall off of the lines and doing line repair. And then the last few days, we're tapping to get prepared for this warm spell. And now the sap is flowing. And so it's flowing through these food grade tubes that link all of the trees kind of into a big, capillary system. And it flows down to our sugar house, fills up some tanks. And then there's a reverse osmosis machine system, which is not dissimilar from how some people filter water, which basically is a high pressure. You're pushing the sap through a filter at high pressure, and we use that to concentrate. So we move it, the sap goes from something like 2% sugar to something like 8% sugar as it gets pushed through the reverse osmosis, which really cuts down on the length of time and the amount of fuel that's needed to boil. And then the last step is boiling the sap and turning it into syrup or sugar, depending on how long you boil it. And so we haven't started the boil yet. We're just in the process of collecting sap for the first time this year. So yeah, that's the quick thumbnail.
Well, from SAP to AI and ReFi, how did we land here today, Gregory? Are we sure are you being supported by Chat GPT in
That
this
was all
Twitter
generated by
space?
chat. That was actually that was actually Sari's
Yeah.
speaking. No, well, um, I mean, gosh, how did we get here? How did we get here? Well, I mean, I think for a long time we at Regen Network have been thinking about, I guess, what people broadly throw into the bucket of AI. Um, a lot of that stuff is just statistics, right? And models that apply pretty cool advanced statistical models to generating, in some cases, an estimation. Like we use machine learning to generate soil carbon estimations for the carbon plus grasslands model, for instance. But we're in this era where there's just huge advances being made in this approach to big new learning models. So we have generative learning models. We have all of the work happening with neural networks and language models like GPT-3. And so on this, and there's just so much going, both in our ecosystem and in the larger world, that I think we thought it would be really great to do another Regenerati News Hour just focused on this topic of what's the intersection of regeneration, regenerative finance, Regen Network, and AI broadly. And so we've got Matthew Pirkowski, we've got Speaker John Ash, we've got Rex. I'm sure there's other folks who may hop in from the audience as well. And we're going to be doing a deep dive. So I think, Matthew has been on Twitter Spaces a little bit. Speaker John Ash, many of you have probably seen some of the amazing videos that he's been producing about his work and my work collaborating on training a GPT model called Ceres, which is a language model and network, like the white paper, the technical docs, the registry docs, and et cetera, et cetera. So we have a chat bot. So those are the two voices that originally had been like, oh, we should really sort of like catch back up and just have that conversation. So that's kind of the overview and how we got from maple sap flowing to AI in a nutshell. So with that, maybe I'd actually love to just go around and just have Matthew and John and Rex all give a quick introduction to yourselves, and maybe, what are you actively working on related to AI, and how is it intersecting with ReFi and Regen Network, or how might it intersect if it's not fully there yet? So I'm just looking at like how Twitter's organizing everybody across my screen here. So I'll just sort of pass the proverbial talking stick over to Matthew first.
Sure. Thanks, Gregory. It's good to be here with everybody. Just at a very high level, well, my name is Matt Pirkowski. I have a background in complex systems, evolutionary psychology, and software engineering, applied in various ways, but recently I've been very interested in a domain of machine learning called active inference. Active inference is a set of statistical, mathematical, and computational perspectives that come out of computational psychiatry. A guy named Carl Friston has a perspective on certain basic fundamental principles that integrate information and uncertainty with respect to observation, perception, and action across various systems. But it's not just brains that he claims this can be applied to. In theory, it can be applied to many broader sets of systems. So I've been experimenting with that in various forms. An early project was using satellite data from the Sentinel-2 network as kind of the eyes of the network, a bunch of different spectral bands, using that as sort of a sensory array to then generate models that could understand soil organic carbon evolution and the uncertainty of the states of that soil organic carbon, and sort of fill in data that wasn't quite there in the soil samples. So soil samples can be pretty expensive and time consuming to generate, but if you can infer that gives you a pretty nice ability to see things you couldn't otherwise see by inferring it from the satellite data, which is much more readily available. And then also extending that work currently with a group called Bioform Labs into networking these active inference processes together as nodes within a kind of living model of organizations. And that can be applied to various types of organizations. So we can talk more about that if anybody wants to, but that's sort of a high level overview of what I've been up to.
Awesome. Thanks, Matthew. And just to kind of like add a little bit more color, and then I'll pass it over to you, Rex, who's like next person in line. So I think also Matthew's been working with John Klippinger and some others on, I guess sort of adjacent to some of the work some of you may know, Digital Gaia, which is a similar or sort of like sister approach to some of this work. And there's a lot of really exciting work that crew is doing that I think may be applicable eventually to corporation and DAO governance. So there's a group called biofirms, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit, because I think there's an interesting intersection there with the approach that John Ash is taking around generative language models and sort of like collective intelligence and sense making, with that active inference approach to modeling and inferring sort of a real world outcome. So anyway, there's some juicy intersection there that I want to dig into a little further down the road. So with that, let's pass it over to Rex. Good morning, Rex. Welcome.
Good morning. I don't know if I've met people here before. Some of you might know me, but I was basically in the silicon industry for the last 12 years, and then I quit to do Web3. And my last job was at NVIDIA. I was working on the NVIDIA Jetson, which is like the leading edge AI component. And I also worked on NVIDIA EGX, which is their edge computing AI hardware and software platform. And I built out the ecosystem for like 200, 300 different companies around that. And then when I quit, I did two things. The first was I joined Saga, which is in the Cosmos ecosystem. And then I also launched the ReFi Summit, which I think may be the largest standalone climate Web3 event. There's probably others in North America, which we're bringing back in 2023. And we've already begun the rollout, the conveyor belt of all-star speakers. So you can see that on the ReFi Summit handle. We have Deborah from Althea Networks. We have all kinds of cool people lined up. So on the AI side, I'm quite interested. I've been organizing a generative AI summoning circle. I just basically CEO and CTO level people doing simulations, edge computing, edge AI. Would love to have people join that if they're into it. It's like we're building a holodeck, actually. A friend of mine, Pete from MoDev, organizes the world's largest voice AI summit in Washington, D.C. So we're actually going to build a generative AI holodeck as a hobby out of that project. So that's what I'm doing. A lot of random stuff.
Cool. Thanks, Rex. Appreciate it. And none other than Speaker John Ash. Welcome up. Thanks for coming.
Hi. So my work is pretty connected with Matt's as well, from a different frame. I come from a neurobiology and communication and psychology background. I sort of lived my life in a way where I felt very misunderstood, in that for some reason I get sort of a strange sense about the future, and I communicate it to people, and then they don't hear it or tell me that I'm wrong. And so I was very interested in finding ways that voices could be heard. When people are saying things that like didn't want to be heard but were functionally true, how do we get that information back into the market? I worked in fintech for about 5 years, and the task that they had me do was that they had a lot of discrete data, a lot of clear numbers in databases that they could add up and visualize. But one part of the data that they just couldn't master was that they had all these transaction strings associated with your bank. And in that little transaction string, it was very noisy. It was very like some random kid typed some random crap into like a credit card reader. And so there was meaning in it, but it was very, very hard to interpret. And it was almost as if there was a complete language within there. And so my work at that time was bringing meaning into the transaction and trying to get a greater sense of what was being expressed in each moment by each person. It was about the human relationship with the data that we have. And at that time, I realized that GPT was coming, and that also that these models essentially could and will increasingly be able to store representations of knowledge or complex meaning in a way that is interfaceable over time. And there's a lot to how you would do that, but it's also connected to Matt's work with active inference, though the models that I work with a variation of that called active learning, which is where when the model is uncertain, it can actually directly query sources of information that it has available to it for more details, right? Which is ultimately, when you're trying to establish the health of the planet as a whole, it's not something that we can define with one single number. I know that there's a lot of like carbon credits as a concept, or the singular variables that we're trying to optimize towards. But if you watch the Listener John S episode with Gregory, you talk about how complex the health of the environment is. It is many different variables interacting, and if there will be a point in optimizing carbon, for example, where you've gone too far. There's a point when optimizing any particular variable in the, well, not any, but lots of different particular variables that are considered healthy to the environment are no longer useful. So it's those variables in relation to each other, that cold, hard data, which we already have a lot of people working on, and we already have these complex ledgers to keep track of all of this discrete data. And there's all these beautiful things with active inference to create all of these many different models coming together in cold, discrete space. But what's more real to me is that after you take all those measurements, who is living on that land and how do they feel? And how do they feel in relationship to like their felt sense of health? What is working and what are they expecting from that land over time? And so to be able to bring all of that, those different types of information together is a huge challenge. And so we have different people at Regen right now focused on those very different aspects of it. And, I study Matt's work very, very, very closely to sort of make sure that my head is in the same space, and I'm in contact with the guys at the Active Inference Institute, because the ultimate goal in my mind is if you can have a knowledge space that you can project information or data to in any form, and you can, as a source, stake, I think this is true, I am certain about this, whether you're an organization and you have computational models, or whether you're just a person who is on the ground and contribute to a real product associated with an eco credit. The point is that with the foundation of Regen Network, you have this very strong foundation of data that we can build upon to create a really intelligent, holistic sense of global health that not only does the data reflect, but the felt sense of the people living on the land also reflect. So it's the bringing together of cold data with the warm data of language, which is where we're working towards.
Cool. So there's a lot there. That was fantastic. One thing. So for those in the audience, just sort of decoding a little bit, warm data is a concept that Nora Bateson primarily has brought to the world. One of her great memes around kind of like contextualizing and embedding information into a context. And so you could Google Nora Bateson, and there's great videos about her talking about warm data. So I kind of want to, Matthew, I kind of like to, well, so there's two things that I want to do here. One is I keep feeling like maybe there's like zooming back out a little bit to, I don't know, maybe the 20,000 foot view where we can get a pretty significant view of the landscape where we're at right now, what we're traveling over, instead of like actually being down in the weeds, is probably going to be pretty useful for me and for the listeners as well. So I'm curious, maybe to ask each of you a pretty simple question, which is, well, I don't know how simple it is to answer, but it's not necessarily sort of like the technical details, but what has happened over the last, say, 6 months or a year that AI is now at this inflection point of being, I mean, both sort of hyped and sort of becoming the new hot thing and the new trend, and there's lots of venture capital moving and there's lots of people talking. We now have some tools available. Like, what happened on the, you know, on the engineering side, on the research side, that shifted AI into our present lives in such a way, both from a news cycle perspective and a discourse perspective, as well as from like, oh, GPT-3, this is crazy. Like, you know, John developed a chat bot that we have live in Discord. People are interacting with. You can go ask the AI a question. What can you describe a little bit from your perspective? What that shift is? What's happened? Why did that take place?
I can say this really quickly, actually. I personally think it really is just how long it takes for the UI to process or do something through the UI or the AI. Meaning, like, we're at the point with the optimization of the UI that it's just bearably long enough processing each thing. And so you can get into a UI flow, whereas before,
so it's a computer, is it compute? Is this sort of like we just have the compute power now?
It's a combination of the compute and the interrelation with how people are relating and using the tool itself. Like, obviously, you know, compute has been increasing consistently for many, many years, and that is a big part of it. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, so it's going to sound weird, but I'll say two words, which are to sort of set the context, which are moldy bread, which is an interesting insight into the concept of something called explosive percolation.
Nice.
Explosive percolation is a concept in complexity theory where it's like, you know, if you have a piece of bread and, one day you see that the actual fruiting bodies have become moldy across the top of that bread, that doesn't mean that that was the moment at which, the entire substructure of that bread was suffused with the sort of rhizomatic substructure, providing the inertia that eventually gave rise to that efflorescence, so to speak. And so, lots of systems are like this, and then the network structure is such that lots of little subnetworks sort of begin to coalesce below the level of perceptual awareness. And this takes place for quite some time. And then there's a moment, an inflection point, where those subnetworks start linking themselves together and sort of pop into visibility. And it seems like a phase change in the system, where from the perspective of all the people working in the domain inside that space of all those subnetworks, it seems like a natural evolution and just sort of an increase in connectivity. But from the outside perspective, it looks like a total transition.
Right. We've been eating this bread for weeks.
We've been
busy eating this bread for weeks. What do you mean it just got moldy? Like, we've been busy. Yeah. So slime mold is another example like that. I mean, basically all of the fungal mycelial structures where you get, you have to achieve a certain density of mycelial interconnections to have a fruiting body emerge. But obviously there's so much going on under the substrate in the soil or in the bread, as it were, or in this case, I guess, like in the interwebs. I mean, I guess in the cloud, in the, in the interconnected network of computers, there's just all of this work happening.
I think conceptually it's been really interesting because I think we're finally, like, the metaphor, I think for people like John and myself, it's been a pretty natural mode of perceiving the world for quite some time, but seeing communication and seeing information and language and all of the things that we take as quite natural in terms of it's very intuitive for us to gain meaning from context and representations and synthesize those together into communication with others and then directed action. But this process of compressing these symbols into something that can then be unpacked into different representations consistently, so generating these deeper structures called latent spaces and the progress that's happened around those, and then the ability to encode into those and then decode out of those into either text or images, that flexibility and the toolkit around that reaching a point of maturity over the past few years, and then really like building nice fast interfaces like John was mentioning around that, and the speed increasing around the computational power to be able to do that in real time. All of that's come together very nicely and created this explosion that has really put the field of AI on the map in the eyes of the public in a way that has only been sort of abstract and sort of seen through the lens of movies and cinema and fiction over the past few decades.
And the receipts are there. I just discovered Matt's YouTube, and he's covering all these topics years ago with a lot of clarity and like quality in the content. But because it is content that is far out on the edge of, the distribution of what is normal knowledge, like he's going out to the very. I think he put out a video called like about a energetic sombrero where you have to go to the top of a hill where there's sort of this, it takes energy to stay in that place to discover new knowledge. But the algorithms, they see that content, and because there's nobody there to resonate with it, it doesn't distribute it. But you can go back and you could see all of that percolation, the slow growing of the ideas throughout the network in these separate individual locations till it reaches that point where it all like hyper grows towards each other and forms this connection. But like all of these topics have been explored very publicly for many years, and I would highly recommend anybody to go check out Matt's YouTube channel, because it's filled with so much brilliance from 4 years ago. And there's so many people acting as if this is coming out of nowhere when it's not.
Yeah, no, for sure. So, okay, well, quickly, same question to you, Rex. Like, what's changed? What is describe how this moment came to be that now we're at this inflection point with AI becoming more and more tangibly integrated into our discourse and our and the internet economy, etc.
I have like a super crazy theory, which is like a lot of the things, the biggest things that are happening, like they've already happened, but we just didn't notice and we didn't have a name for it. Like, for example, like Cosmos is the first network state. And I think before we'd called it something else, or like it'd been called a port city. But until like we had this book, The Network State, we didn't have like a label for what the cosmos is. So I'm looking at AI and I'm like, I think we've already hit an inflection point. This is semi tangible. I wrote this whole like 6-page forecast of the future. I think we're literally at an inflection point already where we're working for computer networks. And it started with Bitcoin and it started with Ethereum. And I think what happened, and it extended to Helium. And I think there was a tipping point, and we didn't even see it that happened. It was just subtle. But that tipping point already occurred, and it's just going to be more and more manifesting. So maybe a lot of these trends like are just natural extensions. We just weren't paying attention, and then it's reached a level where we can become cognizant of it. So with like Ethereum, like Bitcoin, Helium, it's like the machines are literally paying humans. Like we are working for the Helium miners. Like we think we're like setting up the miners, or we think we're setting up validator nodes. It's the other way around. The network is incentivizing humans to do work in the real world. So my hope is that like I think the good version of that view is we've got this, once intelligence is added to that network, maybe we can begin compensating people to do really great work like conservation. And I think it's just this kind of like shades of gray thing where it's already happened and it's been under the surface, but we haven't noticed it yet. And when you add intelligence and AI to like things like Helium and Weather XM, which is like a group crowd weather monitoring solution with compensation, I think maybe the direction we're heading is that working for networks ultimately does result in some of the conservation effects we're looking for. So I think it's been there. We just haven't noticed it, but now it's just coming into view. So that's kind of what I was thinking yesterday.
Cool. Well, there's a whole set of questions that I'm going to skip over, like why isn't Ethereum the first network state and Cosmos is? And instead, I want to dig deeper into, I guess, the specific role of I'm just going to say AI, but I think there's probably better words for this. Generative models, maybe generative models, open and generative models of reality, in in this relationship between humans and the networks that we're members of, right? So there's one element, which is, how do we govern those networks? How are we compensated by those networks? And what are those networks doing? So I guess those are the three levels. So what is the role of what are the roles of these generative models of AI in the relationship between humans and the network states we're part of on those three levels, right? Again, how are we governing the networks? Like, what are the relationships? How do the networks compose themselves? What are the economics of the networks? Okay, what are the networks doing? And I forget what the third one was that I said. But I think you guys got the gist of it. So whoever wants to go first on that question, just talking about the different levels, like how is this going to evolve that relationship? Go for it, Matt.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to get the ball rolling there. And I think it's actually a natural extension of what Rex was just saying to some extent. Insofar as when we talk about these kind of systems or these networks coming into being and then them essentially generating, you could even think of it as a kind of a field theory where they come into being, and by coming into being they sort of generate a field that begins to shape incentives and behaviors, and those become a sort of set of constraints that can interact with human perception, human meaning, and human action, and to start to change those or shift those or parameterize those. And I think that and like Rex also says, you don't necessarily know when you have entered one or exited another. The Schwarzschild radius comes to mind, which is sort of the underlying ideas behind the event horizon of a black hole, which is this we think of it as this very distinct boundary, but if you cross that, you would never know you crossed that. It's the same concept. And I think generally speaking, this idea of an attractor, this idea of this kind of thing that comes into being and then starts producing its own gravity, its own sense of organizational potential. John and I have been talking about this a lot lately in terms of the space of memetics and language, and what does it mean for those types of things to come into being and then start exerting an influence on the behavior and the people around them, or that come into awareness of those ideas. And I think that, the space of AI, the space of generative models, the space of this entire toolkit, the reason why what John and I are doing are so complementary is because in a lot of ways, one of those layers, what John is working on is this really synthetic interface into a world that is extremely counterintuitive for humans naturally, but that also holds a massive amount of potential for changing our incentives for behavior and changing what is actually surfaced to our consciousness at any given moment that can then influence what we consider important in terms of our actions. And consciously designing that and understanding how to be in relation to those kinds of systems is an entirely new mode of interacting with technology, as opposed to the sort of explicit, discrete point and click model of screens. And we're just entering that space, and we're in this really exciting conceptualization and design and imagination process around that. So that's sort of the high level lens through which I see this process.
I'd like to tell a quick little story and then talk a little bit about Ceres and how we're hoping to turn it on in the Regen server. Like, we have Ceres, we have an interface, we have Discord, and we have this capacity where if we want to know what everybody in the community thinks, that we can ping directly each of those people with a particular question, pull all of their answers, and bring in a summary in real time. So if there's hundreds of people and you're trying to form a more complex consensus than just democracy or just, throwing votes in a bucket in real time, that's a possibility. And there's also the possibility that we take this series, which is basically trained on the knowledge about a Regen network itself, but that's changing over time. Like, Gregory's vision changes over time. And if there was a way to open it up to the community to also share their perceptions of what Regen is and how it changes, I think that allows people to have some sort of collective ownership over what the regen meme is, because their very words flows into something that they know is affecting the direction of this larger behemoth that holds so much, entropic and energetic power.
Crazy question for you. Just to sort of be in a dynamic dialogue about this.
Mm-hmm.
This and just for audience, this is all emergent. We've been working on this for months, but it's all still experimental. So, is there a way in which we could easily create sort of like a weighted model where either through token holdings or NFT badges, different network members have differential weight for the actual sort of fine tuning process, and therefore there's sort of like really is a collective. There's a you could imagine many different ways you could assign that weight and other things, but is there a pretty direct pathway towards linking a state machine that's keeping track of that kind of weight and a model that then is expressing a vision and can provide answers, technical answers, etc., of the sort of current state of the network?
Oh, I think inherent in that is a desire to manipulate it, which is what creates such a problem that you have to do it the right way. I mean, yes, you could take just the general pattern matching capabilities of a large language model, and you could create sort of a pattern language that represents whatever type of weighting that you want or whatever type of voting system that you want. You just concatenate the language itself with whatever extra knowledge that you want in whatever symbols that make sense, as long as the representation of that extra weighting knowledge in the text is consistent, then it can learn the pattern and it can learn to associate it in the latent space. The problem is when you throw every bit of meaning into the same canvas, it just gets kind of muddy quick, which is why it's really important, if there's power involved in word and it's connected inherently to your bank account, that there's some security in it, so we can do a quick we're experimenting on the forefront of the future. Yes, I mean, I don't think there's really any other people who are this far along in this type of relationality, but it's still very soon. We could do it, I think, with a Luther pretty quickly, or I could not quickly. It would be hard to do right, is what I'm saying, but we can experiment, and we're on the forefront of things. So
yeah, and I think the general challenges here, just to sort of like double click on the dangers, there's a general set of challenges inherent to politics and human decision making that don't just magically go away when you insert a natural language model or an active inference model or generative AI. In fact, lots of people argue that those same dangers or challenges are amplified. So you get this like amplitude shift.
I want to put an asterisk, AI in general, but I think with what I call the iris and with active inference, because there's inherent to it this nature of uncertainty and its nature of the sources of information relating to uncertainty itself, that it might put an asterisk on that. I want to know what Matt thinks on that particular point.
Could you just explicitly state that question of the particular point?
Well, there's different ways to relate to AI. There can be sort of this monolithic thing where you're just trying to have it be completely unsupervised and it's trying to manage all of the knowledge curation itself. Or you can have built into the relation between humans and the model some notion of uncertainty that is encouraging the people and community to be in relationship to what uncertainty is, rather than using the AI to come into a state of pure knowing and to hide from information that they don't want to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, my general lens into this is something of a multi-scale lens that is not AI specific, The deeper pattern here is basically sort of a lumping and splitting pattern, or a pattern of individuated autonomy versus sort of collective agency, and the tension that is always inherent there. So AI is not one thing. When we talk about creating a model, for example, especially the current family of models associated with GPT that are taking massive amounts of the artifacts produced by a collective, whether that's an entire society gathered through the internet, or what have you, whether it's Regen, these training processes go around collecting all the outputs of the living systems that produced the outputs. So every word is an artifact, every piece of art, every piece of text. These are all expressions. You could look at it as sort of the phenotype expression, or the behavioral expression of the living process, and then essentially encoding those into an abstract mathematical space that is sort of a kind of a collectivized synthesis of and compression of all of those perspectives. But there's no inherent reason why that should be a single compression, right? As opposed to a number of compressions that are put into relation with one another, so you could even have a dialogue between those compressions. So like if we were to do this, has a lot of ties into the future of liquid democracy as well, or possible democratic mechanisms. Because for example, like in this room, in this particular room right here that we're all in, if we were to ask a question, if we were to like play out a game, like, okay, we're going to go through a round of questions, and we have to each point at the person we trust most to answer this, or to sort of like be given responsibility for X. And like maybe like the first thing is like running a maple syrup production process, right? And like the first round, some large fraction of us like point to Gregory. And so, but not everyone perhaps. So then you've already got this sort of like splitting of two subnetworks there. And then you can run that again. And then, basically in theory, you could then train models on these subnetworks and then have still that process of emergent representation. But those two AIs would then be sort of having a meta debate, right?
Because like liquid technocratic democracy.
Well, because the interesting thing though is that like there's some sort of like complexity when it enters the fray, when we're all trying to have our voices heard. At some point you lose information to noise, right? Like we all start pulling, like we all drown out in everyone's desire to be heard. And so we've generated all the technology, democratic, like to run democracy at massive scale, except for the fact that there hasn't been clarity of vision or purpose or articulation insofar as we try to aggregate everyone's democratic voices. And we're gaining the capacity to do that through these kinds of encodings, but we have to be very careful about how we represent it, and whether and what level of like diversity of perspective we still preserve when we train these models across very large spaces of perspectives. And that's always the art of this kind of a process. But I think that reflects the same reality of how humans come together in alliances or networks of shared values and perspectives, and sort of create a collective agency amongst them. And then that comes into relation with people with a slightly different history, who have come into relation for slightly different purposes. And then you're in this position of having to communicate and negotiate. And so I don't think that ever goes away, but I think we are gaining tools to run this process at a higher order that's capable of dealing with more difficult and complex adaptive questions.
So I want to just sort of gut check a couple things you said there, Matthew, before we move on. So just to see if I'm on the same page as you, and try to bring the audience along with us. So you had said, there's sort of, and maybe everybody maybe mute. I think I'm getting a little echo back, at least on my end. So you had said you'd use the term liquid democracy. And you also talked about sort of a Venn overlap as a concept between maybe a fine-tuned model like Ceres and a global model like just the general chat GPT bot, for instance. And John, you had mentioned actually maybe the danger here is totalizing. Like, we don't want to get totalizing. We want a plurality of fine-tuned models.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now I'm just sort of putting those concepts together to try to generate a possible vision of what it might look like, how this technology might impact emerging network states like Regen Network, for instance, or the larger Cosmos Federation. We may have, in Regen Network, we may have Ceres plus 3 or 4 other fine-tuned models. Maybe one is dealing specifically with the science of ecological state monitoring, reporting, and verification, and it's also connected with a set of active inference models. Maybe another is connected more to like the poetry and art. Who knows? There's sort of subgroups. Maybe one is like the blockchain, validation and et cetera. So there's sort of interest groups. And as a voter, I may be delegating my trust to that in a way, and maybe reciprocal to delegating trust. There's some interactivity. Like I can participate in giving my voice. I'm noting that there's sort of 2 relationships or 2 levels of relationships here. One is that we're sort of outsourcing potentially some decision-making power to a machine or a model, right? The second, but we're doing it consciously, and in exchange for that, we're making a deal where we get to influence that model's ability to make decisions, or potentially even override it, right? Is painting that picture of sort of like, oh, I may choose to flow my votes or my voice or my interactivity or my financial support to different models at different scales and for different activities, more or less kind of what you're inviting us to be thinking about, Matt, and maybe also John, like that you're seeing, in terms of a pluralistic approach instead of a totalizing approach.
I mean, yes, the short answer is yes. That's a good summary. I mean, I think especially when it comes to, and in the past I've also written about issues of data sovereignty and data ownership, for example, and the fact that it seems quite likely to me that we will find ourselves, to the extent that we have agency over how our data is used, mediating that relationship, because none of us is going to have 100,000 negotiations a day with all of the systems that wish to access or represent us through our data. We are going to have some sort of agentic representation for ourselves with which we are in relation, linguistic relation most likely, right? Having conversations with these entities that could act as an interface to systems that are continuously running while keeping us from being abused by those systems. Because my general perspective is I don't think we're going to stop the inertia behind the incentives that will bring all of this into the world. And as soon as all these systems are brought into the world, we already see it. There's a massive demand for sucking up every bit of data possible in the art space. This is already starting to play itself out in the courts. And I think that one way of interpreting that is seeing, the representation of our opinion or our data or our footprint in the world as mediated through different layers of these systems that is still, in the final analysis, subject to our choice and our participatory discernment in terms of what associations we wish to maintain and how those reflect our values in the world.
I want to add that, there's sort of this gravity and momentum to the future that I sort of agree with, that the incentives are now there and the knowledge has sort of spread far enough that all of these things are basically going to come into being. And we kind of know that there's a potential for them to be very dangerous. So there's what is the likely future, and there is what the physics of human cognition will likely lead us to. And there's the fact that we're having this conversation now, and that we're being proactive, and we're thinking about the future, and that we're ahead of the development by, I guess, the center of sort of the capitalist heart that only cares about profit. Meaning that it's clear that there's an incentive to cut down labor costs. So lots of corporations are going to use AI to not have to pay human beings to exist while the remaining people, use their remaining money to just cling to a system. So what I think is amazing is that we're having this conversation at all, and that we're exploring the ways that they can be used in a healthful way. Because I just want to tell a quick story, if I could, that my partner had to move out of a storage unit, and there was just somebody there who was that she paid to help her, and I think she paid like $150 in the end. But there was this 4-hour conversation that she had with this guy, and he told her about the entire relationship of his pain with society. And he told her how he didn't have a phone because he didn't believe anybody would call him, and the only person who he thought might call him was his son. He didn't know what crypto was, or he barely knew what Facebook was, but he had a story, like a lived story, and he wanted to tell somebody, and he was so grateful for somebody to just listen to him and hear what he was saying. And to me, I know that there's a lot of attention towards these generative models in a very cold business sense, but to me, that's the magic. And the other half of the magic, I think, is very clearly active inference, because if you're going to be talking about cold, discrete data and uncertainty, and keeping a record of it over time, and having us be able to act in relationship to that data, that is such a solid foundation. But if we can talk about LLMs through this lens of both art and data, and bring together the cold data that we need to evaluate to bring ecosystems back to life, and the fact that there was lived culture there before, that a lot of the pollution that was brought to a place is sort of destroyed. So there's both a healing of the numbers, the cold numbers of carbon and nitrogen, but also just the damage to the culture that has existed there. And I would just love for people to put their attention towards these models in a holistic, integrated way.
Love it. We're sort of approaching top of the hour here. Rex, I want to make sure if you have anything that's emerging on your mind as you're listening to this conversation that you want to throw in, that you have a moment.
Maybe we should pull this out as a topic at ReFi Summit. I mean, like, we're sort of thinking about focusing on energy as a topic and real world assets, but it seems like the interest in generative AI is super, and like exploring what the impact is going to be is something maybe worthy of discussion.
I certainly think a generative AI ReFi intersection set of conversations at the ReFi Summit would be really powerful, because it is such an emergent conversation. So I think I would second that could be really great.
I think in relationship to, I would say, in relationship to what is the active inference, active learning meme is really important for, I think, Regen to get ahead of. Instead of just being this blind generative thing, there's also the fact that Matt's work and my work is tied directly to the uncertainty in there. I just want to add that to the generative part.
So I see, just because my background's in IoT, I see two major topics for generative AI. The first is if you've got cameras and sensors, especially if you have cameras, then that lets you immediately recognize and tokenize things that are wandering around, like animals, trees. So it helps support in the tokenization, bridging, tracking, analytics piece. And then I also see that there's going to be a lot of potential room to generate contracts, like legal contracts, which says this asset represents this token, like this tree is this token. So generating all those bindings. So I can see a big topic. So yeah, check out refisummit.org. I'm just selling here, and buy your ticket, and maybe we'll throw together a generative AI panel, and DM me if you think you'd be interested in that topic, and let me know.
Cool, love it. So, we sort of I've been getting Dave has been lovingly nudging me to try to bring this conversation back to ReFi, and in our DMs I said ReFi is dead, long live GPT-3. But as just sort of joking, but um, hopefully people are understand. Like I think there's a mental leap, right? That, and this oftentimes happens in Regenerati News Hour. We don't really do these as dumbed down conversations. We usually sort of like just dive right off the deep end. Partially that's my bias. I, as a listener, really love conversations in which I'm personally asked to put myself into a domain of conversation, like off the deep end, and then my synapses start firing and I start thinking, and really weave this back to some things that you continue to bring up, John, which is around uncertainty. And for those of you who haven't watched, I would super invite people to watch, at the very least, the little short YouTube video around John. What's the name of the process again? It's fleeing my short-term memory.
Which one are you talking about? The vibes one?
Rating the
uncertainty.
Oh
yeah, I think it's called 100% Vibes with Gregory Landau.
So there's a process that John leads and that I actually got really excited. It'd be super fun to do this, and more as a community, where there's a process where questions are asked and you sort of rate your certainty that it is true, factual, and it starts to it invites us to start to understand that in complex emergent systems, there's a huge degree of uncertainty and edge cases and, poetic paradoxes and all sorts of things that are really worth considering and internalizing.
I just posted it in response, and I want to say about what you're saying though. You said it's not connected to ReFi or whatever. It's like eco credits are very complex, intricate hyper objects that are connected to humans, and they're connected to data, and they're connected to the world. Like the eco credit cannot exist without what you're talking about right now. So it is directly connected back to the ecosystem that already exists. And in the interview that we did, we go very deep into the existing ecosystem of the eco credit and how, Regen and ReFi are functioning right now, and talk about it into relation of what it could be. So it's not just that,
that's kind of where I'm going. It was beautiful.
Yeah. Sorry.
That was beautiful. No, that was beautifully sort of like finishing my sentence there, which is that the connection and the leap that I think we're inviting through this conversation is to understand. I love the concept of hyperobjects, sort of grounding this in eco credits. Eco credits are a symbolic representation of the right relationship between humans and the greater than human living system that they're in, an ecosystem. That's what they are. And we can talk about proof of tree or proof of soil carbon or whatever, but fundamentally what we're tracking is the right relationship. And that requires warm data, not just cold data. It requires an embrace of uncertainty, and it requires sort of like active co-creation and participation in an ongoing process, not just sort of like a linear piece. And so if people are, the things that I'm hoping our community are taking from this are really have to do with like how we lean into complexity, how we lean into governance, how we start to conceptualize the fact that we are now going to have essentially techno politicians and model intermediated money, right? Symbolic representations of carbon credits or whatever it is, and that there are tools, technologies, and artifacts between us as humans and this, and networks and economies. And as we lean in and we design those relationships, the technology, how we, Matt, you were speaking to, I think really beautifully, the role and multidimensionality of, for instance, like copyright law as it relates to, data sovereignty, as it relates to what the model is saying, right? So, hopefully people are taking away a really juicy set of living questions, not just a set of, maybe right answers to the wrong questions.
I just have to slide in the last 2 seconds and say I think the future is better synthesis and collaboration between the networks, nature, and human beings. And the idea that the network could hire advocates that work on behalf of natural resources and build those advocates. All these lawyers are unable to get work. Why wouldn't the network hire them? Like an individual elephant might have a lawyer assigned to them to represent their rights. So anyways, I like that framing. So thanks a lot and have a good one.
Awesome. So super appreciate everybody's time. Thanks to the panelists. Matt, if you have a last word, and John, if you want to share a parting word before we go, that'd be great.
Gratitude.
Yeah, sure. So I just, I'm always inspired, especially, so after John's story earlier, I think, I'm reminded of the reality that no matter what we're doing here, it always eventually has to connect with human experience and the felt value or lack thereof in the kind of actions that we are scaling up as a society. And therefore, I'm always reminded, and I try to keep at the front of my mind, the quote by Buckminster Fuller: "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." Right? Like that idea, I think, is something that we can hear John's story and then be upset and try to attack what we perceive as the source of it, or we can take a perspective that is based on attraction, the creation of something new and more artful, more skillful, and more beautiful, and then more attractive, hopefully. And I think that the reason this conversation is perhaps at the surface level somewhat divergent from direct connections to regeneration is because we're talking about these potentials associated with this new set of central technologies that are fundamentally the set that whoever deploys them most skillfully and attractively is going to be able to shape the future of humanity most centrally. And so I think it's very wise to invest in thinking deeply about these types of technologies and how they are going to integrate as the sort of synthetic fabrics, so to speak, of our organizations of the future and the way we network to one another as human beings in the world that ground out in action and experience, and whether that's going to make people's lived experience more fruitful and joyful or more miserable, right? So
awesome.
Yeah.
Last words, John, and then I'm going to wrap it up for everybody.
Well, gratitude, and I would recommend that everybody search on YouTube Speaker John Ash and Gregory Landau, because there's like 2 hours of very high quality content that is just breaking down regen from top to bottom and all the things that you couldn't even possibly imagine that you wanted to know.
Thank you for that, and thank you also for that lovely conversation we had, and sort of digesting it into different components and putting epic music over it, and it's super fun. Well, so to end out, I'd like to just plug next week's Regenerati News Hour. We're going to have another really amazing one. So we're going to have Steve Zwick from Vera on right here on the Regenerati News Hour. So we're going to get to dig in directly with Vera. We're going to be talking about the recent, Guardian scandal, stuff with South Pole. We'll be geeking out about baselines and high integrity carbon credits and the role or the not role in blockchain, etc. So it should be a really fun conversation, and I'd love to see everybody here next week for that one. Who knows? Maybe we'll even ask Steve about what Vera's doing related to AI in their workflow. Probably not much. Super grateful for everybody's time and attention, as always. And have a beautiful week, and go outside, and don't spend all your time on the screen. All right. Ciao,
Have a great
everyone.
day, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Yeah. Later, everyone.
Bye, everybody.